One. Legislative Democrats want to quickly push through universal background checks. And we're talking with a representative of the National Rifle Association who's opposing the bill. Welcome to Nevada Politics Today. I'm your host, Victor Jakes. Dan Reid is the Western Director of the NRA, and he testified Tuesday in opposition to the bill. Dan, welcome to the show.
Victor, thanks for having me.
Well, Nevada 2 years ago passed a universal background check initiative. It was drafted poorly. It was never able to go into effect. And this background check bill would basically fix the drafting error. What's wrong with allowing the will of the voters to go into effect?
Well, Victor, this isn't what the voters passed. And as you mentioned, question one had significant flaws, which was how the background check was to be processed. And it was pushed as being the free federal system. And this is different. And Nevada taxpayers are going to have to pick up the tab on this one.
Let's go to some of the people who support the bill. One of those was Attorney General Aaron Ford. And yesterday he testified, and this is one of the things he said. Let's go to graphic one. Research shows that in states with these checks, 46% fewer women are killed with guns by intimate partners, 48% fewer people commit suicide with guns, and 48% fewer police officers are murdered with guns. That was from his testimony yesterday. Won't background checks save lives?
Victor, there was just a recent study out of California. California has had expanded background checks for decades, right? And the UC Davis Center, along with Johns Hopkins, studied it, and they put control measures in there to study this. And they said that expanded background checks on private transfers, as well as expanding prohibitors to misdemeanor crimes, had no effect on violent crime with firearms or suicide. And this was a peer-reviewed study. This wasn't a study that was cherry-picking dates, times, states for convenience.
Yeah, I think when people think about background checks, they can envision that, if it's a private party, you'll sell to a criminal who's not supposed to get a gun. But you're saying with this study that, there's no impact on crime. Why is that?
Well, there was actually another study that was released, and the study's been done several times, and it was with inmates who have been convicted of gun crimes, and they polled where they were getting those firearms. And an overwhelming number are not getting them through any sort of legal means. They're never even interacting with the dealer. They're getting them through, the black market, through theft, or they're getting it from someone off the streets. I mean, there's just a number of ways that they're going to circumvent the system. And under this law, they're not obeying the current laws. They're not going to obey this one. And even if they were to go out and try and purchase a firearm or acquire a firearm under SB 143 or under question one, the penalty's not on the person that's going to be receiving the firearm. It's on the person that's transferring the firearm. So for a criminal, there's no risk under this bill other than what's under current law, and we should start enforcing the current law vigorously on those prohibited persons.
When you testified yesterday, you talked about some of the unintended consequences that you see happening if this bill goes into effect. What are some of those?
Sure. One of the things that I think that goes with what we were just speaking about with the penalties is the proponents of this bill talk about, hey, we've set aside reasonable exemptions for common lawful activities. And a lot of these exemptions, the terms are just poorly defined, and that's throughout the bill, including the word transfer. The very heart of this bill is not defined anywhere. And the proponents were asked about that, and they said, yeah, they admitted it's not defined in the bill, but basically anytime you're relinquishing possession of a firearm, you're going to be required to go to a dealer to perform a check unless you meet one of these enumerated exemptions. But let's say I loaned a gun to my best friend and he said, hey, Dan, I'm going to go hunting with this gun. And he deviated from that course. I'm the one that's liable, not him, because the penalty's on the transferor. And that's without even getting into the fact that the hunting exemption is almost unworkable unless you're going to be traveling with the person that is hunting, because it requires that you possess the firearm in all areas where it's legal to hunt. So that makes public roads, perhaps if you have to go through an area that's closed to hunting, that makes you in violation of the exemption, or you're not going to fall within the exemption, which is problematic. And as I also pointed out in testimony, This is stricter than California's laws when it comes to hunting exemptions. California, with their expanded background checks, allows for someone to loan a firearm for hunting for the duration of a hunting season.
And here they don't do that. You know, Nevada has a kind of a unique rule where you can't amend initiatives for 3 years after they've been passed. This legislation has an effective date of January 1st, but it will be passed less than 3 years since the initiative was passed. Does the NRA plan on suing on those grounds?
Well, Victor, we're looking into legal challenges. We've been following this initiative. We've been actively engaged in the state in opposing it, and we're actively engaged here on the legislation. And I wouldn't rule out any legal challenge at this time.
And speaking of legal challenges, there was a lawsuit about this, and Attorney General Adam Laxalt, when he was Attorney General, the court found in his favor that this initiative wasn't enforceable. Now, new Attorney General Aaron Ford came out yesterday and said that they're working with the people who had sued to run the private party initiatives through the Department of Public Safety until this new bill would go into effect. What are your thoughts on that plan?
Well, we've seen the press release. We haven't had a chance to sit down and discuss it in any more detail. But obviously, the Attorney General was there in support of this bill yesterday. Unfortunately, the committee didn't ask him any questions specific to that or specific to revisiting the opinion of former Attorney General Adam Laxalt. He was allowed his 2 minutes and he left. But that would have been an interesting thing to vet out in committee, along with whether this process of amending the initiative prior to the 3 years is legal under the Constitution.
And do you guys think you will sue on that if you make your determination that it's not constitutional to do this workaround through the Department of Public Safety?
Victor, as I mentioned, we're not ruling anything out at this point.
I want to jump to another gun bill that's going to come up, the so-called red flag laws, where if someone knows someone with a firearm and they're concerned about their behavior or they're exhibiting warning signs of violence, that they can get a court order to take that person's firearms temporarily away. Have you looked at the proposed bill in Nevada? What are your thoughts on that?
You know, we've started reviewing the legislation, and this is similar to what Senator Ratty had proposed previously, and we've seen bills like this across the country, from California to Hawaii to Oregon to Washington, et cetera. And the biggest issue with all these bills is due process. A person is going to lose their rights based on a third-party allegation. They've never been convicted of a crime, they've never been adjudicated mentally ill, and suddenly they become prohibited. That's not how our system of justice should work. Not to mention, these bills come in and they say someone is so dangerous they can't have firearms, but go along your way. We're not going to offer any mental health services. We're not going to take any further action other than saying you are no longer able to possess firearms.
So are you opposed to this bill on principle, or is it just that proponents haven't gotten the specifics right? Would there ever be a red flag bill that the NRA would support?
You know, Victor, we look at every piece of legislation carefully, and right now the proponents of these bills have not budged on the due process issue, and I think that's a major concern. It should be a major concern for all Nevadans. If
they do budge, are you willing to support a version of that bill?
I can't give you where we're at until I actually see physical language on a bill. As you know, these pieces of legislation are so complicated and they require such precision. Shifting back to SB 143, this background check bill, this bill was released 21 hours before committee, and we went through this carefully, and the flaws in this language are incredible, and we're looking at an issue regarding how FFLs are actually going to process this, and we believe that they're in conflict with the procedures that are laid out by ATF for how to conduct private party transfers. Language matters, and I think dealers are going to be put in a really tough spot between ATF procedures and the language in SB 143.
Dan, I know there's a lot of controversy about this, but we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Victor.
And thank you for watching. Remember, if it involves Nevada politics, we're talking about it right here on Nevada Politics Today. I'll see you next week.